Thank you for coming. Good morning. My name is Huda Ahmed, and I'll be going through the experiences of British Yemeni people. Now, my research is on two levels, and because I want to focus on the title and the theme of this conference, I'm going to focus mainly on the British Yemeni. But if I could just give some context to my research and some background, then at least then we know where we're looking at the British Yemenis from which angle. So I began my research. I did a part-time PhD. So while I was still teaching, I was doing a part-time PhD in education. And I was a lot influenced by my professional observations in schools, particularly in secondary schools, and particularly with Yemeni young people. And I wanted to know a little bit more about them. I wanted to find out about what influenced their lives, and what was it about them as a community that brought them together or kept them apart. So that was quite important for me. I attended a lot of their community centres, their youth programmes, just integrated with them as much as possible. And I engaged then with the literature on youth identity, on personality paradigms, and a way of trying to explain who they are, their structures. So because of the focus being British Yemeni young people, I also employed or researched about post-colonialism and intersectionality as a theory to see how some of these are linked together to enable me to understand more about the young people's agencies and structures. So with these in mind, I undertook a pilot study, and the purpose of it was just to try all the research approach and design, particularly using photography to understand more about their experiences. But what I found out from that, I discovered that there was a disconnect between the ideas of the young students being who they are, and particularly how they provided an essentialized and perhaps a static notion of who you are based on how you look, or how you speak, or your color, or your gender, and you already had those assumptions coming across. So that idea itself felt like a narrated story. So when I explored my own identity and personality as a British Yemeni person, so I wear a headscarf, so I'm a Muslim, I'm not too old to be doing a PhD, but I'm not too young either. I come from an ethnic minority group because of the colour of my skin. My English is good, so I must be born and brought up in the UK. So all these ideas come across on social identity structures, and it sort of puts me in a group automatically, just being who I am and where I am. So this whole idea, and I argue that based on like social structures of race, gender, class, ethnicity, language, and many studies of diaspora and ethnic minority development and engagement of practice of young people are linked to what might be viewed as an essentialized nature of identity, a sense of identity that's interlaced with aspects of society and culture. So although there's importance in that, and I don't dispute that, the difficulty is that it provides an abstraction of what it means to be an ethnic minority young person in the UK. And so all these identity structures, how much of them actually talk about how we live our lives, okay, how our lived experiences work. So I'm not simplifying other identity structures or perspectives too much. All I'm saying is that there's a tendency, a difficulty with utilizing an identity social theory, which suggests a slight fixed position and perhaps doesn't allow for continuity, evolvement, development in everyday life, which brings together relational moments of engagement, and then it produces who you are and who you're becoming. So as a direct result from my initial pilot study and from the exploration of my own personality and my own identity, I moved away from focusing on some such abstractions. And so to provide a more complex perspective of this, I searched for different sets of thinking tools that allow me as Huda Ahmed and others to focus on the daily lived realities. How is it that we live? And that was provided by the conduct of everyday life. So in my research, I give attention to how British Yemeni young people conduct their lives. And when I say conduct their lives, it means how they live as active subjects in their everyday practices. So the concept considers how people collaboratively produce and reproduce their life through daily activities, through their habits, through their routines, through their personal arrangements of things in their social relations. So I argue that that's one of the most influential way of understanding people and their lived experiences. So I use ideas particularly from Dreyer in the theory of the person, and then Roth from the learning and development to articulate lived experiences. And I argue in my research that living and being is reflected in your actions. And this gives vital information of a person's developed and evolving personalities, but it also reflects their evolving identities. And I believe that it's in what you do is who you you develop and you change and you know yourself. So that's just the context of where the conduct of everyday life comes in from. So just, you know, the angle of where I researched about British Yemenis. So that's the bigger umbrella, and then one group of them were these British Yemenis. So, so I came up with a conceptual model that takes away a deductive, inductive, abductive approach. And then I had 9 different case studies, longitudinal studies, where I produced narrative portraits of all 9 of them, looking through this theory and the data across the side. So that's an example of one of them. So Nuha is one of the young people, British Yemeni person, and how her order arrangement, how her situated participation in movement, how conduct of everyday life tells us about her lived experience. So that's the content of where my research comes in. But what I want to focus on today is British Yemenis themselves. Why British Yemenis? Why have I employed British Yemenis, and who are they in the first place? So the main reason I looked at British Yemenis, I come from a scientific background. So all my education previously was science. I did biochemistry, I did medical sciences. I was not in the social science realm at all. And then I went into teaching. And when I went into teaching, there was a big gap between the science and the social sciences in terms of, I very much believed in power was number. So I believed in like lots of quantitative data, how we quantify people, how many numbers are there, who is achieving, who is underachieving, that kind of thing I was looking into. When I moved on to do my PhD in education, it was more to do with the social science aspects and looking at the breadth of the depth of some of the studies. So I did look at different case studies. So I chose British Yemenis particularly because they are under-researched group of people, although they are one of the early settlers in the UK. So since the 1860s, British Yemenis have come into UK, yet we don't know very much about them. So just to put it in a bit of perspective, so geographically, the Yemen is over here and Britain is over there. So Britain at one point colonized the UK in 1839 and until 1967. So that's 128 years of colonization. And when they colonized the UK, Yemen, they gave an opportunity for Yemenis to come to the UK for employment purposes. So there was a note in 1965 where 12,000 Yemenis migrated from the Yemen to the UK, and they settled in different cities, particularly these on the board. So you have Yemenis that settled in Cardiff, Hull, Liverpool, South Shields and Swansea. They worked primarily as sailors, but because they already came as sailors from Aden, or Arden, they used their skills and settled in UK sailors. Other young people came and settled in Birmingham, West Midlands, Manchester, Middlesbrough, Newport, Sheffield, and they worked more into industrial employments. So like many other settlers, there were many changes that took place to these 12,000 Yemenis approximately that came into the UK. And these changes included family structures. So many Yemeni men, particularly that traveled, married within the English society, so they married white women, and you have generational young people that are of Yemeni descent, but also have a white English woman. Employment patterns changed, public services were changed, and there was reports of some racial harassments on these early settlers when they came into the country. So like other ethnicities, I'm just generalizing, but like other ethnicities, they did struggle, but they also continued to retain their own ties with their families. And they sent money back to the villages that they came from. They built houses back in Yemen. They also carried out practices in the UK that was very much linked to people in their homeland. So they use the Arabic dialect in their everyday conversations. They dressed traditionally. They attended special occasions. They bought mutton from Yemeni butchers. They made it into stew. They got people together. It was more communal. They served it in a huge dish according to the Yemeni custom. They also extended their hospitality to visitors in the same way that they would have done in Yemen, back in their homeland. So they tried to continue those traditions and those cultures as they went along. They also continued their religious connections to Islam during weekends and public holidays. And in the summer holidays, they attended mosques and it served as a social and recreation activity. Most of them till today still note that they do their duties, their religious duties, such as prayers and fasts. So although the Yemenis lived in these communal areas and they stuck to these different places, there was evidence of them also integrating somewhat into the societies, but it was all generational based. So my main research is not about them in the past, but it's more about them in the future. Okay, so I looked at and examined the life experiences of 9 British Yemeni young people longitudinal across 2 to 3 years. And I worked out how many of those young people actually linked to their cultural back at home, back in Yemen. And so my research was on 2 bases. One was looking at each individual on their own, vertically through the conduct of everyday life, and then looking at them horizontally. What is the things that they shared, what themes that they had together as a group? And 5 main areas came about, which I want to focus the talk about here. Am I in time? So I don't want, no, if you just go back to the old.
Yeah, we're fine.
Yeah, okay. So there's 5 main themes that came out from British Yemeni young people study, and I know I'm only basing it on 9 participants. We don't really know how many British Yemenis are there in the UK. In 2027, there were estimated 80 to 100,000, but there are no quantitative data to suggest that. So the first main elements that these young people talked about was their image and how they looked, because for them that was quite an important part of their daily lives. So not all of them were a headscarf, for example. A lot of them were very much interested. They're all into TikToks and YouTubes and following bloggers. And some of 1 or 2 have said that they follow ones that wear a hijab because they do, so they can see that their fashion corresponds to that. Other young people didn't really link them being Muslim or them being ethnic minority to how they looked. It was just, I need to look good. So it's one of the most essential. My young people are 16 to 19-year-olds, so that's quite an important part of their lives. And I'm sure when I was 16 to 19, it was the same policy for me. So that was a fundamental thing about them being young people. The second thing, which was quite interesting, was the food and how they classed traditional food. One of the ways of preserving cultural Yemeni culture is through food and eating. So we have a few of them that have said about what their parents used. So we have this thing called a makla, which is like where you put the beans and the toast and you keep it warm for a while and then people eat together. There's conversations about eating on the floor. There were conversations about sometimes we'd eat on the table, sometimes it'd be fish and chips, which would be traditional fish and chips. And they called it traditional, although that's more of a British tradition rather than Yemenis. They don't have fish and chips in Yemen. So a lot of conversations about where they eat, how they eat, using their hands, getting communal areas, bringing people on Fridays to come and eat with them, particularly because Friday is the end of the weekend and it's practiced back in Yemen, that it's a traditional time where families get together and they socialize with each other through food. So food was a big element to continue the culture being across, and a lot of them used the terms that we use in Arabic to represent their food. And a second thing which was more interesting for me than anything else is the idea of back home. Tony, is it Tony yesterday? Tony was talking about, when we go back to Native American, when we go back home, and I was more interested about how his children would respond to what back home is, because all the participants did not associate themselves strongly with Yemen being back home, mainly because maybe that's the only way that they know is the British way of living. So back home was always a phrase that they used. And when they went to Yemen for different purposes, mainly for holidays, Kelly names it ethnic pilgrimage, which is amazing because it means as soon as you do go to your native homeland, you do get your culture, you do learn your language, you do become that person and you're part of that. But at the same time, the young people felt that they weren't very much Yemeni. So they're neither Yemeni nor British in that sense, that may be more associated with Britain. Now, I know these are generalized comments, but these are second and third generation British Yemenis that we interviewed, and this is what came out. So home was just a phrase of where it belongs and what happens. The third part was quite interesting as well, it was the language. So all of them all 9 of them attended supplementary schools. So they went either on a Saturday. I myself, when I was young, I attended 5 days a week. It was then 5:30 to 8:30 every single day for 5 days to an Arabic school so I can learn Arabic. I didn't love it, but I'm glad I know it now because I know how to read, I know how to write, and how to speak. That is something that not a lot of people do know. So I'm very grateful for to my parents for doing that. But I can't say the same about my own children because firstly, that isn't a provision that's provided. Secondly, it's a different world altogether, trying to drag them into Arabic school to learn a different language when they've got the school in the morning to try and work. But then their Arabic isn't as strong as mine. So it's the idea of losing that part of the culture that a lot of the parents particularly are trying to avoid. But the young people did say that the Arabic is part of their history, it is part of their culture. They also switched languages. So I'm not sure if that's in all cultures, but like if I want to say, I want to pray is Salli, and they would say, I'm Salliing. So they put an ing at the end and put the term in there to try and bring them together. They also switched languages when they talked about, just automatically, they say, inshallah, mashallah, like la hawla, all those kind of things related to God. It was just something instant. And even though whether they're religious or not, whether they practice, it was a term that they often heard maybe their parents or their grandparents, that was passed on two generations. So Arabic was definitely part of the culture. And if I'm just going to link those 3 together, it was mainly when people went to Yemen and spent the summer holidays there that they came back with good spoken Arabic language because they fully integrated into the Yemeni culture and with the Yemeni people. So it was fascinating to see that. And so going to Yemen, and also a lot of their food relations were always spoken in Arabic. So those are the things that allowed them to link to them being part of the Yemeni culture. And the last thing is their religion. So although I wouldn't say all of them had showed religious practices as such, there was something in their narrative to show that they had some kind of religious affiliations to Islam, particularly because the majority of Yemenis are Muslims. We have a small group that are Jews, majority of them are Muslims. So those were the 5 main areas where Yemenis showed in Britain of generations showed that they are part of the Yemeni culture, although at the same time they showed that they connected to the British culture at the same time. So the idea that comes across after these discussions and what I generated at the end is there is something called the cultural hybridity, which is you have a little bit of both. Okay, and it's okay to have a little bit of both, especially if you're within generationals across the side. So for you to have fish and chips and then have asid and hilba at the same time is fine. For you to be able to speak English fluently, but also have a bit of Arabic in you as well, that's also. So it's good to have that kind of idea that it's okay. Ethnicity itself is not simply historical legacies of migration or conquest, it's more than that. And it's constantly undergoing changes and development. But the idea is if culture is to remain where it is from where you've come from, supposedly, it should be passed on. So I can't expect my children to learn Arabic unless I pass on the Arabic language. I can't expect my children to know, how we sit when we eat together, or how the hospitality of people taking place. I can't expect it to happen unless I do it myself. So it is a historical thing that it is passed on generation, and it's starting to fade away a lot more as the British Yemenis are integrating more into the culture. Previously, when they didn't, when they were previous, just at the beginning, please. So previously, they when they were go back one more. So previously there were settlers there. They tried to keep themselves together, and so that they wouldn't lose that culture and that heritage. But as time went forward, and people integrating to others through marriages, through going to schools, through being part of the British culture, or the British environment, society, the culture also started to not disappear as such, but reduce itself in terms of how they live their living experiences across the side. So for me to do a research on British Yemenis, I provided a platform for their experiences to be shared in the academic realm, but also for us to know how culture can be continued, how it is continuously reshaped in relation to our places of upbringing, but that our cultural identity can come from both. One may be more mainstream than the other, one may be more subcultural, but it all depends on different case studies and how parents and generations before them keep that going across their generations. So the idea is to provide a better correspondence and understandings of who British Yemenis are, through their lived experiences, without essentializing who they are, without deciding that this is who they are based on how they look, or based on assumptions that we previously have in social identity structure markers. So I think that's about it for now. If you have any questions, we will take them hopefully at the end of the next presentation. Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, my name is Aynur. As already heard about me, I did my PhD on the topic of analyzing indigeneity and discourse, within the discourse about Kurdishness. I looked at the Kurdish political movement in Turkey, is the empirical research. Just a bit of background where I'm coming from to topic. Actually, I did my master's degree at Deakin University in Australia. That's how actually I started getting into Indigenous studies, first experience of Aboriginals and Native Australians in Australia, actually. I did my research on the Western NGOs, the role of Western NGOs within the global Indigenous rights movement. I looked at the different regions for my research, North America, Pacific, Oceania, Latin America, Asia, Africa, but it is a significant invisibility of the Middle East, Indigenous peoples of the Middle East. I looked at the four main NGOs. They had a significant role within the global Indigenous rights movements, like IWGIA is the Danish NGO, founded by anthropologists and run by anthropologists. They are also consulted within the United Nations. If you check latest report, in the Middle East, they identify the Indigenous peoples and issues region by region. Latest report even identified only Bedouin people in Israel, Palestine, and Israel occupied a part of Palestine. Other Indigenous peoples of the Middle East and Mesopotamia are literally invisible. But then what happened after the First World War is just Middle East disappear, Mesopotamia disappear into Middle East and become nation states, the Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. And the Kurds are, I'm not comfortable with the use of numbers, but approximately 40 to 45 million Kurds in the Middle East in 4 different countries now: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. I look at the Turkey parts of Kurdistan. Kurdistan is self-identified homeland, ancestral land of Kurds. That's my research based on, change it, please. Like I said, what I'm going to talk about indigeneity, the concepts of indigeneity and ethnicity, why they're different, and how different and how indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights is important, and the Kurdish political movement was part of one connect to. Key concepts is that actually, when we look at the key concepts, it's nice to be presented in an indigenous focus conference. I usually do in Kurdish studies and explain indigeneity, but I'm pretty sure we all now familiar with the indigeneity definition of indigeneity, and it's a scholarly definition. Of course, we're talking about contested definitions, ethnicity and indigeneity, but it's now a significant differentiation between indigeneity and ethnicity, and especially indigenous scholars last a few decades identified and draw attention to indigenous peoples have distinct and significant rights. Yeah, we heard one of the names in the field, Linda Smith says that sufficiently knows that often only Western cultures are allowed to be diverse and contradictory, while indigeneity expected to be pure, of one mind and aesthetic and easily identifiable. One of the actually issues by the Western, of course, from the Western idea and mentality, because it's the indigeneity, when it becomes indigeneity and it becomes indigenous discourse, which means with the global indigenous rights movements and claiming self-determination on their lands, and become controversial by the nation states and Western states, I would say. And previously, indigenous people defined it primitive, backwards, wild, is the all negative connotations. But when the indigenous rights and trying to indigenous rights starting to be evaluated and recognized by the international law, for example, ILO and United Nations, and the self-determination is the main point, then indigenous definition become the controversial. Who is indigenous? Are they their, ancestral land, historical land? Did they leave the land? All sort of definitions. And then Linda Smith, one of the well-known scholar, says, yeah. And Alan Bernard, an anthropologist, he is one of the main, again, well-known scholars, and they argue that there might not only be one definition of indigenousness as a situation of indigenousness in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States cannot be seen as a privilege, or it's not the same situation in indigenous peoples of Europe, Asia, or Africa. Because the settler colonialism, when we look at settler colonialism, even again, it's new. When we look at Australian history, actually, they define the territory land, the terra nullius, is the Latin, which means empty land, no one's land. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, it's the Aboriginal people identified because it couldn't be ignored more. Is the definition settler colonialism versus indigeneity is clear here, but Africa, Asia, and Europe, it's still controversial. Who is indigenous? And Barner's definition is the acceptable point that the classification of indigenous as indigenous is not that only they predate to other people, but that they predate the state formations established to protect such other peoples. Predate to state formation. When we look at the United Nations declarations, the definition of indigenous peoples also said that predate the establishment of state, nation state. Please. Okay, what constitutes indigeneity? As I said, it's not an exact definition. But we're talking about contested definition. But there are four main principles of indigeneity. First thing first, self-identification of identity, unique language and culture, identified ancestral territory, spiritual and historical bond to territory, and self-determination claim. Significant shift occurred in 1989 when the International Labour Organization adopted Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 169, which came into force 1991 after being ratified by 22 countries. Again, it says the convention applies to people in independent countries who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from the population which inhabited the country or geographical region that the country belongs at the time of conquest, colonization, or the establishment of present state boundaries. I also identify this is important, and it's the second important part is its self-identification as indigenous and tribal shall be regarded as a fundamental criteria. Is the previous convention of ILOs in 1957 is with the global indigenous rights movements. ILO actually evaluated and adopted the first one 169 in 89. Okay. As said, as indigenous peoples can claim minority rights under international law due to having a distinct language, culture, and beliefs, they also have specific rights under special international laws and regulations. As I mentioned, the Indigenous and Tribal Convention, this is the first institutional recognition, 1957, and the Indigenous Tribal Convention, just mentioned earlier slides, 1989, and more recently, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. It's more comprehensive because it's after almost 4 decades of constant work, including NGOs, Western NGOs, including indigenous peoples around the world, and the 4 decades work at the United Nations, and it's the last one, UNDPR. When I'm looking at the experiences of indigenous peoples, in my case in Kurdish studies, I adapted to theoretical perspectives. One is internal colonialism. I looked at from the internal colonialism perspective. The other perspective was, of course, is overviewing post-colonialism as well. Other one is the Orientalism within Orient. It's studied by the Kurdish scholars as well, how Kurds treated in Turkey, treated in the Middle East, within host states, nation states. And what I'm looking at, why did I look at decolonization, internal colonialism and decolonization is international law. Under the international law, also there's a strong implication. When the United Nations Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples is the convention on December 1960, should be considered differently for overseas colonies and border colonies. While 1, 2, 3, and 5 of the 7 closed decision encouraged the independence of overseas colonies, 4, 6, and 7 encouraged the prevention and suppression of the decolonization and liberation movements in border colonies. That's the thing about law, international law. It's open to interpretation. It's not clear. But one of the well-known scholar, sociologist, he has a significant distinct work on Kurdish studies as well. Ismail Beshici actually point out this differentiation in border colonies, and he identified actually he sees Kurds as one border colonies within nation state, as I said, and it's according to the convention granting, and Kurds and other indigenous peoples that are considered as border colonies, and it should have been going through the decolonization process as well. And recognizing, as I said, the internal colonialism, when we In short, we said the internal colonialism seeks to explain the subordinate state of racial or ethnic groups in known homeland within the boundaries of larger state by dominated different people. As I said, actually, I overly acknowledge post-colonialism as a theoretical perspective as well, but the main was internal colonialism because it's the post-colonialism critiques the colonizer, but internal colonization and decolonization theories critics and try to suggest the delinking from colonizer and colonized practices as well, mentality. It's best stated comparatively, its relatives. This theory provides a more true interpretation of colonialism within national borders. Importantly, it defines the unequal position of indigenous people more effectively than theories based on class assimilation, diffusion, immigration, or work. As I mentioned earlier and previously, indigeneity responds to the demands of contesting colonialism. It's creative and new solution to new problems. As I said, is the conceptual differences in decoloniality. The key point is they're not only a critique of colonialism, but the linking from colonialism. It's indigenous studies is clearly and actually it's a growing studies on focusing on internal colonialism and decolonization, because it's the post-colonialism. It's only post-colonialism doesn't respond to acknowledge, but there doesn't respond to the struggle and experiences of indigenous peoples. That's the self-determination right. I mentioned earlier UNDPR, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, includes the most controversial aspects of indigenous rights, self-determination right. Again, it's the different interpretation, of course. It's based on the definition of indigenous peoples who are indigenous, but UNDPR identify indigenous peoples have right to self-determination by virtue of that they freely determine their political status and freely pursue the economic, social, and cultural development. But we are not talking about here, we are not identifying the self-determination one form. Indigenous scholars, Professor Gary Foley, in Aboriginal scholar, says that there is no definition. So part of Australia, the population of Indigenous Aboriginals, the population more than settler population. Comfortable to say that why not? Is the state. We should have all state there. But the self-determination means, again, economic, social, and cultural. Why not we can't have education in our mother tongue? Is our self-determination or cultural practices. It's a little bit, again, is Australia actually moving forward in terms of recognizing indigenous rights. They actually are being to an accord. They do have a special council group for constituted by the elderly Aboriginal peoples, especially for the youngest cases. But as I said, is the UNDPR is the definition of self-determination right for indigenous peoples. What's the difference? What makes the difference? Why? In 1992, ethnic minority rights recognized and again updated by the United Nations as a United Nations Minority Declaration. It says that recognize the minorities' existence, affords to guarantee their rights to non-discrimination and equality, the promotion of multicultural and intercultural education, nationally and locally, and the promotion of their participation in all aspects of their public life. It's perfectly normal. It's 1992. But indigenous people's rights, all the ethnic minority rights entitled to they have, plus they have self-determination right, rights to access the control over natural resources on their lands as well. That's the difference. How indigenous rights perspective is a bit more comprehensive. Back to Middle East, or is, as I said, is the scholar actually now working on indigenous peoples Middle East, why they are invisible. Is it then, is it due to the part of the UN's inability, or maybe also unwilling to confront the question of who is indigenous, or is international politics, is the nation states tied to international system and international institutions? There's no answer, but that's the obvious point to invisible indigenous peoples. And the experience of Kurds in Turkey, why I'm interested, as I said, when I look at the indigenous, global indigenous rights movements, I look at the definition, experiences of indigenous peoples and the Kurds in Turkey. I'm originally from Turkey. From there, in terms of my positionality, as far as I know, I'm not Kurdish. I was brought up by Kurdish. In Turkey, a bit tricky though. I might be ethnically, if I do actually that DNA test, I might be Armenian, I might be Kurdish, anything. But as far as I know, I'm not, I can't, I don't speak Kurdish, but I am familiar with the situation because I left Turkey in 2009. I'm familiar with the political situation, and I'm familiar with state practice because I am actually coming from another group, actually, this oppressed religious group. I know first-hand experience of state oppression and marginalization, discrimination against the identity. I wanted to do Kurdish because they do speak Turkish very well, Kurds in Turkey, because the official language, their language not recognized. It could be in terms of indigeneity perspective and positionality, I wouldn't do because it's to me and to according to indigenous studies have to be based on self-identification. Kurds experiences in Turkey, the underdevelopment of the Kurdish populated region is the enormous, and it's the systemic implication actually, and forced internal displacement, especially in 1990s. Is, if I'm not wrong, is that about 40,000 villages is actually this located post displacement, and the banning of the Kurdish language, non-recognition and denial of Kurdish identity, and historical excess and assimilation practices and marginalizations. And Kurdish study now, especially with the help of diaspora studies, last 2 decades, in almost now, lots of sources on that. And studies of Kurds in Turkey, I already mentioned the experiences of Kurds in Turkey. The Republic of Turkey was established as a nation state in 1923, based on only ethnic identity. Of course, there are discussions about this and ethnic identities and national identity, but it is accepted as an ethnic identity. With the change of existing the Kurds and denied from the mid-1920s until the end of 1980s, the Turkish state assumed there was no Kurdish element on Turkish territory. But it started actually emerging, talking about Kurdish doesn't mean the Kurdish identity was recognized. It's become obvious because of they now are labeled as a terrorist because of the Kurdish political movement. I'm going to talk about, and the Kurdish political movement emerged the claim of equal citizenship, constitutional recognition, their identity, cultural right, education in mother tongue, and self-determination of the model they suggest. What I did for my research, I looked at 3 types of data. I looked at the Kurdish political movements, pro-Kurdish political parties. Well, I started with the PKK, is commonly known, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, established in 1974. It's become a guerrilla movement. It's the Turkey, the US, and the EU recognize a terrorist organization. It's become a guerrilla movement in 1984. And then Kurdish political movement as the pro-Kurdish political parties emerged. Most of them is closed down by the states, they merged, and the recent one, HTP, now in the parliament. What I did, I looked at the program and rules, including funding manifesto of PKK and press releases and statements from newest parties, Peace and Democracy Party and People's Democratic Party in relation to Kurdish issues. And I interviewed 20 deputies of HDP. 15 of them, I interviewed 20 MPs, 15 of them and self-identified Kurdish, 1 Armenian, 2 Arabs, 1 Turk MPs from this party. That's how I collected my data. First thing first, why as I did this research based on self-identification, because it's the main principles of indigeneity. And when I was doing, of course, doing my placements, my field work, one of the previous co-chairs, 2 co-chairs actually still in prison, is the Selahattin Demirtas, self-identified Kurdish himself. In the third hearing of the main trial of Selahattin Demirtas in 2018, he stated that we are a part of this country too. This is our motherland too. We did not come here by exile, or we did not accidentally stop here as crossing borders. We are the peoples of this land. That's the pure example to self-identification. As I said, identified the main principles of indigeneity and looked at for principles, self-identification in the Kurdish political movement is absolute refusal of being ethnic minority. They don't accept as the ethnic minority. They say we are Kadim Halk in Turkish, is in English, autochthonous nation of Mesopotamia. And that's also said they are primary constitution of one of the primary constitution of the Turkish Republic, because during the independence war, between the collapsed and Ottoman Empire and actually Western imperialists already divided Turkey, and then independence war. During the independence war, Kurdish delegates and Turks had an agreement to build a new state based on 2 nations, Kurdish and Turkish nations. But then Turkish leaders obviously betrayed, ignore that agreement and build a nation state based on the Turkish identity. That's why Kurds said the primary constituent of the Turkish Republic as well, self-identified, cultural and linguistic significance, recognition Kurdish as a mother language. Definitely demand education in mother language and demand media and communication in mother language. That's and historical bonds, spiritual bond to homeland. Kurdistan, recognition Kurdistan as a social, cultural, and historical homeland of Kurds. Is the Kurdistan, as there might be confusion, it's never been a political entity, is the part of different form of political entity, but never as a Kurdistan. But all the Kurds consider the Kurdistan, like I said, divided 4 nation states in the region: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And they said when they're talking about Turkey part of Kurdistan is the North Kurdistan, and identify Kurdistan. What happens in Iraq, Kurdish regional government is the part of Kurdistan as well. In Iran is the whole homelands. And the self-determination claim, also there's the PKK founded in 1974. Based on from independent united Kurdistan, the main aim was, but now with the Kurdish political movement, they advocate and suggest a democratic confederalism or democratic autonomy is the form of federal governance system developed and actually advocated, has been advocated for decades now. As I said, is from independent united democratic Kurdistan with PKK and 1990 to 2005 is Kurdish political parties started talking about strengthening local governments. It said the decentralized governments based on active participation actually is called a radical democracy. And then since 2005 is the 2 latest, newest pro-Kurdish political parties developed the concept of democratic autonomy. I interviewed one of the MPs in 2009, Ahmed, and he is a lawyer as well. I ask about democratic autonomy governance model. What's his understanding? He said that I liken that model of radical democracy or direct democracy, a little bit to the honeycomb. So maybe we should think about that when we look at the honeycomb, there is thousands of pores in the honeycomb, that bright little pores, every pore is filled with different nectar from different flowers, but all pores are horizontal, which does not involve hierarchy. Is the model for ancient Mesopotamia. That's the Kurdish political movement. In Turkish politics, in the Republic history, is the only party so far talking about peoples of Anatolia, peoples of Mesopotamia. Previously, only people recognize one people. Peoples means they recognize other ethnic identities as well. Is Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmens, Mohallemi. I think pretty much only struggle of decolonization and the Kurdish political movement is still struggling, as I said, the latest, now the current pro-Kurdish political party is still in parliament, but we can't now, it's really so difficult to follow up with the Turkish politics because the constant clash. How many MPs in prison? I don't know the exact numbers. Like I said, is when I was doing my PhD, it was 56 MPs actually elected, and only 44 MPs were eligible to interview. Other ones in prison, in custody, and the ongoing custody. And after the latest local election, HDP, the current pro-Kurdish political party, won a total of 65 municipalities, including 3 metropolitan municipalities, 5 provinces, 35 districts, and 12 town municipalities. And the result of trustee appointments by the state, by the government, current government, only 4 districts and 2 town municipalities remain. To conclude, that as Kurdish identity themselves one of the ancient peoples in Turkish Karim Halk of the Middle East, democratic confederalism government model is introduced by the Kurdish political movement of Turkey, is promising statutory termination model not only for Kurds but also for the other indigenous peoples of the Middle East. And Kurdish political movement also paved the way for all whose identity, culture, and land have been colonized. Not only actually for ethnic identities, the religious identities as well, is strongly suggesting, as I said, is they broadly defined as a radical democracy, active citizen participation, based on citizen participation, gender equality. It's a really broad topic. Yeah, pretty much. There is no greater sorrow on earth than the loss of one's native land. It's how long and how old is it? Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you.